as you all know, I mean, it's a remarkable thing. When you've had a near-death experience, someone asked me yesterday what the negatives are. You know, we all talk about how great it is, how beautiful it is, how wonderful, blah, blah, blah. And it's a question I'd never been asked. And I am quite sure that all of you who've had an experience can appreciate what I'm about to say. And the negative that I could identify was that it's a very lonely experience. It's a very isolating experience. And so it is so much fun not to have to talk about the background, not to have to feel like I'm alone. So thank you. It's really a privilege. And many of you were here last year, and many of you have heard my story. And hopefully today I'll touch on some aspects that maybe I didn't talk about last time. And I plan to go through things and probably skip over some things that I did talk about and leave quite a bit of time at the end for questions, because I feel like it's that question period of time that really allows us to talk about the things that you in this room today really care about and really want to hear about. So forgive me if I skip over things you thought I would talk about. You can bring it up during the question session. But my experience began in 1999 when my husband and I decided to go to Chile, a town in southern Chile that is an area well known for kayaking. And my husband and I are avid kayakers. We've kayaked for many, many years. We've kayaked across the country. This is something that was one of our passions, and I might add, still is one of our passions. And at that time, we had 4 young children. My youngest son was about a year old, and we felt that it was finally time that we could leave the country by ourselves. And any of you with kids can certainly appreciate the watershed moment when we thought, oh, yes, actually time together. That was really going to be a treat. And friends of ours spend their winters in Chile kayaking and running trips. They bring down American clients. And so this was not something new. This was not something out of the ordinary, and they're very dear friends of ours. So we went to Chile and had a wonderful week of kayaking. And on what was going to be our final day of kayaking anyway, we had decided to paddle on a section of river that's well known for its waterfalls. And when I talk about waterfalls, I'm talking about things that are reasonable, 15 to 20 foot drops. These are not, Niagara Falls. We're not going over in a barrel. It's not something that is out of the realm of reasonable kayaking for someone who is experienced. If you're not experienced, yeah, it would be a little crazy. So we had planned on going on the section of river, and that morning my husband actually woke up with back pain, which is not something he'd had before and hasn't had since. But that morning I woke up with back pain, and so he did not go on the river with us. I went on the river with, again, these friends of ours who are professional boaters. They own a raft and kayak company. This is what they do for a living. And then there were a couple of other Americans. And we went down the river and went over the first couple drops, and that was fine. And we came to the first significant drop, and it was early in the day, and so we sort of pulled out into an eddy at the side of the river and talked about how we were going to run it, and had decided that we were going to run through a smaller, sort of more minor chute or gap because the flow was a little bit less and we were still kind of getting it going for the day. And so I pulled out in the current, and I don't know how many of you all kayak, but this is a very high flow, high volume river. And once you're in the current, you're not turning around and paddling back up. This is a commitment, which is one of the things that I actually like about kayaking. And kayaking challenging rivers is that it requires absolute focus, precision, skill, etc. And so I was out in the current and heading for the smaller chute, and the person who had preceded me had bobbled it a bit and ended up sideways in this drop, and it was a fairly narrow little chute, and so her boat was pinned, and she was able to then pull her spray skirt off, that neoprene fabric that spans the distance between a kayaker's body and the deck of the boat, keeping the water out. She was able to pull that off, push herself out of the boat, and she was flushed downstream. But the problem with the river is if there's something across it, it's a strainer. And what that means is it's like a colander. You know, you put the pasta in the water and the water flows through and the pasta stays. So on a river, if you're going into that situation, you become the pasta, which is not a good thing. And so in general, that's the type of situation you avoid. So I didn't really have many options, in fact, none. And so I veered over and went over the main flow, the main part of the waterfall. And as I went over the top, I have to say I sort of groaned internally and looked at it and I thought, oh man, because there was tremendous volume going over this particular drop or this waterfall, and I couldn't see a clean outflow. And I thought at the top of this that what would happen is that I would hit the bottom, immediately flip upside down. I assumed that I wouldn't be able to right myself because of the turbulence and because of the volume. And I assumed that I'd pull my spray skirt off, push myself out of the boat, get tumbled around, and spit out downstream. And that is an experience that is never pleasant. It's not fun. It's not the good part of kayaking. But it would not have been the first time that I'd been tumbled around in a rapid. That is part of kayaking. And unfortunately, it's probably not the last time either, but we all like to think that that won't happen at least. But nonetheless, that's what I assumed would happen. And I certainly didn't think about drowning. I certainly didn't think about that. But I hit the bottom, sort of preparing myself for this several minutes of misery before I popped up downstream. But instead what happened is I rocketed down and the front end of the boat became pinned in the rocks and the underwater features. And I and the boat were immediately and completely submerged under 8 or 10 feet of water that was cascading down. And the weight and the force of the current absolutely pressed my body to the front deck of the boat. And I am a spine surgeon. I am a very even-tempered, calm person. I'm very used to high-stress situations. You know, perhaps I relish them, I'm not sure. But regardless, I didn't panic. Many people have thought, oh my gosh, you must have just absolutely panicked. But no, I'm not a panicky kind of person. So I immediately set about to do those things that would either free the boat from whatever was catching it or free me from the boat. But the force of the water was such that I couldn't pull my hand back half of an inch, let alone pull my spray skirt off and push myself out. I was absolutely stuck. And I am a very concrete thinking, pragmatic sort of a person. I knew how far from shore I was. I knew my predicament. I've seen people die on the river before, and I knew that the likelihood of someone coming and saving me was as close to zero as it could be without being zero. And it was at that point in time that I made the first choice in a sequence of choices that I believe changed my life forever. And at that point in time, I didn't ask God to come and save me. I didn't ask any of that. I asked that God's will be done. And the reason I think that changed my life is because it was the first time in my life I actually meant it. And I think that most people who have ever asked for God's will to be done or who have ever prayed the Lord's Prayer probably is just like I was. You know, I grew up going to Sunday school, and I took my kids to church, and I've said the Lord's Prayer, I don't really know, but certainly hundreds or thousands of times. And in that prayer, of course, you ask for God's will to be done. But I was a very self-confident, highly educated person. I mean, I had my life under control. And when I asked that God's will be done, when I said that prayer, I asked the same way most of us do, which is I want God's will to be done as long as it's pretty much in line with what I think should be done. And on my timetable, of course. But when I was underwater, I really meant it. I asked that God's will be done, whatever that meant. And that's what I mean when I say it was the first time I really meant it. And at that moment, everything changed. I was immediately overcome with a very physical and real sensation of being held and comforted and reassured that everything was fine. My husband would be fine, my young children would be fine. And it was that word fine, not great, but fine. They would be fine regardless of whether I lived or died. And this was the first of many remarkable and profound parts of this experience for me, because I knew that I was being held by Christ. And it's not something I talked about for a long time because it seems very presumptuous. You know, why me? But one of the profound aspects of that was that I knew that Christ would be there holding anyone who asked. And it was such an intense experience because it was as though many of you have had the experience of having a little baby and just pouring your love into that baby and everything you are and all of your hopes and dreams and everything you are. And in this situation, I was that baby. And Christ was just filling me, pouring his love into me. And it was remarkable. And my little thought balloon off to the side, because I was still me. And I am a fairly cynical and skeptical person. My little thought balloon was looking at this thinking, oh, that's really kind of weird. That's strange. But I thought, okay, well, let's just see where this goes. And I then was taken through a life review, and it was not what I expected. I can't say that I ever had thought about death in the sense of what it would be like for me. During my training, my career, I certainly have been around death. I have certainly thought about death as it relates to other people. But I can't say I ever really spent much time thinking about my own death or what that process might be like. If I had thought about a life review, I probably would have thought about the Hollywood version of your life, flashing before your eyes, and you look at some things and you think, yeah, I was really good there. And then there are other times when you think, I could have been better there. But for me, it wasn't like that at all. Actually, it was so far removed from anything that I would have expected that even now when I think about it, I think, wow, I couldn't have made it up. Because it was the most remarkable thing. We did go through my life, and we looked at events in my life that in any other situation I would have described as sad or bad or challenging or horrible, all sorts of words like that. Recognizing that those are judgments that I've put on them. And then I had the most incredible experience of seeing the impact of a given event, not 2 or 3 or 4 times removed, which we can all understand. You have a bad day at work, you go home, you yell at your husband, and then they're mean to the kid, and the kid, is mean to the dog, that whole sequence. We can certainly understand the impact within our own little world of events. And in fact, when we look at events that occur elsewhere, we similarly really evaluate those events based on how it impacts us, our world, our view of the world, our emotional state.